Welcome to the Golden Hinde podcast, where we'll be chatting about everything from Francis Drake's circumnavigation of the world to the Spanish Armada, Elizabethan seafaring, pirates, to the adventures of our full-scale reconstruction in the heart of London. This episode of the Golden Hinde podcast is presented by...
Hello, this is Alan. Our ship was built between 1971 and 1973 at the Hinks family shipyard in Devon, southwest England, with lead shipwright Alan Hinks. Today, I'm delighted to welcome to this episode of our podcast Alan's daughter, Alison Boyle. Hello, Alison.
Hello, Alan.
Welcome to the show, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I wonder if we could start, if you could tell our listeners just a little bit about yourself, please.
Yes, of course. I was always very interested in the yard and enjoyed going to the yard with my father. It was his yard. To quickly appreciate the history of myself, I left school at 16 and did an OND in business studies in order to work in the yard as my father's secretary. And it was my aim, I hope, to sort of take over the yard. I worked in Hinks Son, but sadly the work was beginning to lessen. And so I had to find somewhere else to sort of, earn some money. And I'd married the guy that I adored, and I started to work in his company in sales and promotion and things like that. And I got some of the biggest contracts that his company ever had. So that gave me confidence to sort of go back into the yard. And my father was thinking about promoting fiberglass ships. And he wanted me to sort of help, sort of find a market for that and sort of, get people interested in buying fiberglass ships.
Did that work out for you?
It did. It was an interesting mix. And I can remember in 1980 going to the Southampton Boat Show in order to sort of help promote fiberglass ships. But it was at the same year that the Hinde actually sort of sailed in as a flagship to sort of celebrate the history of the Hinde. And it was terrific.
Fantastic. So perhaps let's talk a little bit about the yard then. Could you tell us about the history of the shipyard, what you know about the history of the shipyard before the Golden Hinde was built?
Hinks Son was established in 1844 by Henry Hinks, who was then registered as a blockmaker and boat builder. Henry established himself as a designer when in 1851 he entered a competition to design a 30-foot lifeboat. The competition coincided with the Great Exhibition and was organised by a group of men who later formed the RNLI. Henry came second and received a certificate, £100 and a medallion. All gone now, unfortunately.
Oh.
Henry also
that's a shame.
Yes. Henry also owned several small vessels that sailed on the popular trading route established in the 18th century between North Devon and Newfoundland. Unfortunately, however, information concerning the founding and development of the yard is very limited. Bills and estimates were as likely to be drawn up on the back of envelopes as formally written on notepaper. Henry was succeeded by his son Joseph, who established the name Hinks Son and increased the size of the yard. One of Joseph's boats, a Clovelly Picarona, is on display at the National Maritime Museum, or was. I don't know now if it's sort of still present, because I took that from an article I wrote for Devon Life magazine in 1985.
Right.
On Joseph's death in 1910, his son John returned from sea to take over the business. He had spent a few years working as a carpenter on the North Atlantic run on ships carrying immigrants from Europe to North America. The vessels were mainly rowing boats, passenger launches, pilot cutters, yachts, and fishing vessels. John retired in 1949 when the yard was taken over by his son Alan, and Alan was my father.
It's an incredible history, really, really varied, and very kind of indicative of what was going on in the world, sort of throughout the 20th century, isn't it? What are your earliest memories of the working shipyard, Alison?
When I first started working for my father, it was in the original yard, and so that was below the level of the street, and you had to go down what was known as a drang in the West Country, a little sort of narrow passageway which took you down to the level of the shipyard, or the boatyard as it was then. And it was the smell of oakum and the sound of sort of, timber sort of being fashioned and made into shape. It was just lovely.
It sounds wonderful. And was your shipyard part of a larger shipyard community in that area?
Appledore did have a large shipyard in the area, which was set over 100 years ago. And that was Appledore Shipyard, which now, thankfully, although it was closed down about 10 years ago, it's going to be sort of hopefully reopened, which will be super. And at the time of the Hinde, the managing director of Appledore Shipyard was a gentleman called Joe Boyle. He lived in the north of England, and when he moved to Appledore, he had a house built on land at the end of the drive at Stalham, which is where I live. My father and he became very good friends, and Joe Boyle was very supportive. The masts for both the Nonsuch and the Hinde were stepped in place at Appledore Shipyard, and trials for both were run from there. There were two small yards in Appledore as well, that of Waters and Ford, and further along the river was Bideford Shipyard, of which my maternal grandfather was manager. To grade them in size, it would have run Appledore Shipyard, Bideford Shipyard, J. Hinks Son, and then the two smaller ones, Waters and Ford.
Wow, so incredibly productive shipyard community, an amazing thing to grow up around. Many of the key people involved in the production and design of the Golden Hinde, I know, for instance, Albert Elledge and Art Blum, who were the entrepreneurs who commissioned the ship, they came to England during the build. Do you remember meeting them?
Definitely, absolutely. I did meet Al Elledge, but he didn't leave me with a strong impression. But Art Blum was a totally different story. He was not regularly handsome, but he was very charismatic. I think during the time the Hinde was being built, Art Blum brought 3 different wives with him. They were all gorgeous and quite captivating. And even though I was definitely not important in the scheme of things, Art Blum was kind enough to take the time to enthusiastically greet me. When the Americans came here, my mother and father would try to show them places of interest in Devon, and I was included in these ventures. One of these visits was to an area around Castle, where there was a witch's house open to the public to attract tourists. Art loudly stated that he didn't believe in witches before he came inside, whereupon he fell over and broke an expensive camera. An old woman looked across the road and said, "That'll teach you."
Yeah, serves him right. Brilliant. He sounds like quite a character. I suppose you'd need to be to decide to build a great big wooden ship in the 1970s, wouldn't you? So, I mean, obviously, as well as the Golden Hinde, with all that productivity there were other large ships built at your family's yard as well, weren't there? Would you be able to tell me a little about those?
we mainly sort of went on to sort of build fishing vessels, and the wooden fishing vessels, just before my father died, before my father had to sell the yard, we were building some of the largest trawlers for Scotland. So that was quite something in itself, because we were looking at other sort of, yards in England, and none of them were doing the vessels of the size that we were doing.
Right.
My father considered developing a fiberglass yacht based on a wooden production. And ironically, my father took one of these yachts to the Southampton Boat Show in 1980, the same year that the Hinde was sailed in as the star of the show. Frank Muir was a guest of the organisers, and I can remember wearing a sky blue jumpsuit to match the blue of the sponsors, Barclays Bank, and a brief film of me talking to him about the excitement of the Hinde.
I remember Frank Muir quite well. He was one of the team captains on Call My Bluff, wasn't he? That's what I remember about him. He was very kind of urbane and witty and had magnificent bow ties, if I remember rightly. Yeah, he was really, really funny and really, really bright, wasn't he?
It was just lovely, the whole experience. My father was also approached to build a J-class yacht, which of course would never have been possible in the yard that we had, because J-class yachts were so huge. But it was just, lovely being approached to talk about that. And I can remember the excitement of having two gentlemen come from Warner Brothers, and they were thinking about the film Mutiny on the Bounty. And they were wondering if my father could build a replica of the Bounty. One of the things about the Bounty, of course, was she went to Australia, and they wanted David Lean as a director, and he was in Australia at the time. So that would have sort of fitted in nicely, except that they thought it had to look at cost, because it was a film production. And they thought if they built it in Australia, they didn't have to adhere so much into the history of traditional wooden boat building. They could have steel rigging instead of having sort of, the rope rigging.
Well, that's kind of a shame, isn't it? It would have been amazing to see that being built as well.
And there were also two Japanese gentlemen that came over to talk about a vessel that had gone to Japan. The original vessel had gone there in 1561 and had sunk at Nagasaki. And they wanted to sort of rebuild that vessel. And they thought that, having been inspired by the Hinde and the interest in the Hinde, that they could sort of, use that as a means of getting tourists to Nagasaki. The Hinde had been sort of filmed in sort of, dramas and used in film productions. And yes, the whole thing sort of seemed to tie together that this could be a good opportunity to get tourists interested and money spent.
But it never came to pass, I take it.
No, sadly, I think when it came down to it, they had the desire, but not the money.
Yeah, I can't imagine that building a large wooden ship would be cheap by any means. With all of this going on, I mean, it's just such a tremendous amount of activity, really, and something really incredible to be around, especially when you've got so much of that history is sort of woven into your family history. So, how would you say that the shipyard itself has impacted on your life?
I think it's just filled me with a tremendous excitement about the romance of the whole thing. It was just beautiful to experience, and I was very lucky to have experience, because it's not something that many people will sort of, have. You've got the building, the history of the building, and then you've got the romance of all the adventures, and yes, it's just wonderful.
Certainly for me, being a Londoner, it seems like an incredibly unusual and exciting way to grow up, really, to have that in your family. I mean, sadly, the shipyard is now closed, as have many yards of a similar nature. Can you describe the build-up to the closure and what's there now?
The build-up to the closure was very sad. My father had just signed a big contract for a fishing vessel. The person who was thinking of having the fishing vessel needed to receive grant money. And at that time, that would have been Fioga would have been providing the money for the vessel. It went to sort of the authorities of Fioga. And when it came down to it, they declined. So the money wasn't coming forth. And my father has sort of tried to hold on to sort of, keep it going. But when that didn't come through, he had to close the yard. And it was very sad.
Roughly what year was that? Can you remember?
1980.
Okay, and I suppose the size of the yard means you'd be really dependent on a single commission, really, doesn't it?
We didn't get money from repair work because we didn't have the facilities to sort of, take vessels in to repair. It had to be new build. So you're looking for new contracts all the time.
Is the shipyard still there, or is there something else there now?
No, it was taken down. Sadly, it was taken down because it was sort of becoming more dilapidated. And the people who bought the yard, they themselves ran out of money, so they couldn't put work into maintenance. So the whole thing just deteriorated, and it became so unsafe. It had to be taken down by the authorities. I think it was the local council took it down because it's so unsafe.
Well, that's very sad. So is it just an empty space now?
It is. All that's left is the old sort of cottage, which we converted into sort of offices. That's pretty dilapidated as well. But there is one inhabitant.
Right.
An owl. And if you go to the garage, which is next door to, the cottage, you can sort of sometimes hear the owl cawing or even see it.
Beautiful. I love owls. If anybody out there is listening and thinks it's time that we opened a shipyard museum in the Appledore area, please phone us with your money, and we will build a museum on the side, which would be amazing, wouldn't it? It would be the perfect thing to put there, wouldn't it? It would be a tribute to this incredible industry that you had around there. That
would be wonderful.
So get your checkbooks out, folks. Let's make it happen. What are your happiest memories of the shipyard, Alison?
It's hard to define separate memories because the whole thing to me was a pleasure. To see a vessel being built, see it going from the plans, and the plans, they were taken upstairs to the mould loft. The plans would then be sort of drawn out, the size of or sort of like templates, the size of the ship. So all the different frames would be drawn out, so you could see the vessel sort of, how the form would be created. Once that had been done, the patterns would be made in sort of, plywood, brought down to the main yard, and then they would be put onto big stacks of timber and onto the thick sort of, timber forms, and then cut out. There is one lovely photograph of sections of frames all sort of stacked together on top of each other, and it's quite beautiful, sort of the curves of it.
Is there anything else about the shipyard or your family that you would like our listeners to know that we haven't yet talked about today?
At the moment, I think no, but it's possible, Alan, that I might come back to you and say, "Oh, I forgot to mention." And
there was one thing I wanted to ask you about just before we finish, which is I hear you were briefly a television star in your youth.
You're thinking of the Magpie.
I am thinking of the wonderful show Magpie, yes.
That was so exciting. I was picked up from school when I was about 15, I think. And I can remember a bit of a furore going on because my father's secretary ran into the school and said, "Oh, quick, I've got to pick you up. You've got to come down." And saying, "Well, why?" Obviously, it had been passed by the headmistress and everything. And she said, "Well, Magpie are here and they want to talk to you because they've said that they've heard that you wanted to take over the yard." And I said, "Oh, wow." So I can remember going down there and just saying that because the interviewer said, "And what would you like to be when you grow up, little girl?" And I said, "I want to take over my father's yard." And I can always remember my father. I was so excited one time because he'd been drawing out sort of, lines plans of ships, and he showed them to me and he said, "Well, what do you think of that? Is that right?" And I looked at them and I thought, well, what do I say? Because to me, somehow it just wasn't quite right. And I said, "Well, I think you've got to really shape it a bit more around the bilge." And he turned the page over and he said, "Like that?" The thing was that it made me feel that all the time I'd spent with my father and in the yard, just sort of, as a young girl, there's something inherent in the building of wooden ships that I must have picked up.
You're just absorbing everything by osmosis, aren't you, when you're spending that much time around shipwrights and ships and amazing. Well, Alison, it's just been so wonderful to speak to you. Thank you so much for bringing this absolutely crucial stage in the ship's history to life for us. Thank you for taking the time to join us, and it's just been amazing hearing all your lovely stories.
Oh, thank you so much.
That was the Golden Hinde podcast. For more information, head over to our website, goldenhinde.co.uk. Remember, there's a letter E on the end of Golden Hinde. You'll find videos, blogs, educational resources, and of course, all the details you'll need to come and visit us. We're also on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Thanks for listening.